Welcome to this third episode of our online seminar series called Revisiting 10 Key TANTlab Papers. Today's topic is critical proximity. I am very pleased to see you. Some of you were at the first seminars and some of you were not. Both things are really fine. These sessions can be followed individually, but since they're all circling around some of the same topics, we might, of course, refer back to previous sessions. I should say that we will be recording this session and later make it available through various platforms. My name is Torben Jensen. I'm a professor of Science and Technology Studies and a leader of the Techno-Anthropology lab. I'm also one of the three hosts of this series. The two other hosts are Mathieu Jacomy, who is an engineer and a developer of digital tools and an assistant professor in TANTlab, also my next door neighbor here in the TANTlab. The third host is Matt Artz, who is in Philadelphia, where he works as an AI product manager. Matt is a great friend of the lab, perhaps the lab's greatest friend in America. And he's also a mover and a shaker in the American field of applied anthropology. So why are we doing this seminar series? Why are we revisiting 10 key TANTlab papers one at a time? The term revisiting is key here. We discuss these papers because each of these papers raise interesting issues, but none of these papers really settle them. The issues still live on and take new twists and turns. So it's worth taking a look back, but also taking another look at how these issues are developing. In the Techno-Anthropology lab for more than a decade, we have been discussing how to combine digital and participatory methods. We have many ideas, but the jury is definitely still out. We have also been discussing how to follow and engage with the digitalized society that we are inhabiting. Again, we have ideas, but no final answers. And in the broader sense, TANTlab has been a location for a discussion about the roles that we want to play as engaged scholars, and about what kind of stories we want to tell about life in the digital Anthropocene. These are discussions that we really would like or enjoy having and would like to have and want to keep going. The selected papers are inroads into these discussions, but luckily we also have tour guides on these inroads. So we are very happy that the authors have agreed to join us. And with them, we really hope to bring out the interesting issues, dig into what is not in the paper and what was around the paper, and bring them out for a common discussion. We begin each of these seminars with an author interview. Today, Matt will interview Andreas Birkbak, who is an old-timer of the lab. Andreas was in the lab from 2013 to 2022. Andreas is the first author of this day's paper, and Matt will try to tease out how Andreas thinks about critical proximity and how this issue may perhaps have moved in the meantime and look differently, since this is a 10-year-old paper. There are also two other authors of the paper, Morten Petersen, who sends his greetings. He's very frustrated that he couldn't be with us today, but he had to travel. And then there's also myself. I will keep quiet during the interview and leave it to Andreas and Matt and save my comments for later. After the interview session, we invite all of you to join the discussion. Before handing over to Matt and Andreas, let me just briefly introduce today's paper. The paper is from 2015. It was published in a journal called Techne, Research in Philosophy and Technology. The title is Critical Proximity as a Methodological Move in Techno-Anthropology. The paper, for those of you who read it, will know that it is a little bit existential in the sense that it discusses how the, at that time, very new field of techno-anthropology should go about its business. It draws on Latour, Haraway, and Maris, and it proposes an approach called critical proximity, which is defined more or less as the opposite of the critical distance approach that one could find in a lot of critical sociology, both back then and now. The paper discusses two substantial cases as examples of how to practice critical proximity, and it ends with 4 specific methodological recommendations. In the coming hours, I'm sure we will have time to unpick or unpack a lot of this. So again, warm welcome everybody. Thanks for coming. And without further ado, I will hand it over to you, Matt and Andreas.
Thanks, Torben. Great. So yeah, so jumping right in. I've said this a few times, but coming from the States, is, another paper that I found, very instructive, and particularly, as somebody who's gone through an applied anthropology program here and has always worked in industry. I will say that my default state, right, is to think about sort of localized or kind of contextual problems that arise in working through, and with, end users in very participatory ways. And so, that's the context that I bring to this paper and why it resonated so much with me and why I also think, it's a value for folks like me. But I also think its value goes much beyond that because it does seem like today, I in my experiences, there are many people who go instantly to grand problematizing without sometimes appreciating the local and the value that maybe we could all contribute to those sort of situated problems. And so I wanted to maybe start with that as a frame, but then and we'll unpack critical proximity in just a second. But because for you, this paper is also now, as was noted, 10-ish years old, right? So sort of at the outset of you all trying to define techno-anthropology, how was it, what were you trying to achieve with the paper beyond just critical proximity? Was this trying to set a foundation for the discipline? And if so, how do you think the field has matured and did it realize its goals?
Excellent question, Matt. Thank you, and thanks for having me. I think you're right to start from. It's a very appropriate place to start because the paper certainly emerged at a time that was very early in my own career. So I was a PhD student, and I think Morten, who is the co-author with Torben as well, was an assistant professor at the time. So, and we were in a very special moment in time where the whole education in techno-anthropology at Aalborg University was a relatively new thing. The field was emerging, and we were trying to contribute, in fact, to I found out while looking back at the files from 10 years ago, a special issue edited by Catherine Othfeld-Kass, Lars Botin, and Galit Wellner. So it was also talking into a context of other scholars invested in the field of techno-anthropology. And I think definitely we were trying at that point to put down some goalposts and to find out sort of where are we going with this and recognize also the diversity of people that were invested in this field at the beginning and trying to respect that diversity while at the same time signaling a specific direction that is drawing, as you also put it, I think, on anthropology and on science and technology studies and on actor network theory and many of these sensitivities, which could have been other things. I mean, some of the colleagues that we are also in conversation with come from a more classical philosophy background, for instance, or work as ethicists. And the journal itself reflects this broader arena that we are talking into. It's also a philosophy of technology journal. So I think that's an important context. And just in this sort of first starting up remark, I'd like to also just briefly acknowledge Torben and Morten because Torben played a very important role simply as bringing in this concept via Latour. The critical proximity concept also comes from Torben's paper from 13 and his inaugural lecture as a professor in STS. And Morten was certainly just as much a first author as me. So we're maybe talking about alphabetical order here, not a hierarchy of authorship. So it very much emerged as a conversation between Morten and myself at a point when we were still very young scholars, and I'd like to acknowledge that. And of course, it would have been amazing if he could have been here as well.
Yeah, no, great. Appreciate that. And so appreciating, you're sort of one of three there. For you, how has, your view of critical proximity changed? Do you still think it stands in the way that you positioned it in this paper and that it is as important as you made the argument then?
Yeah, in broad strokes, I would say yes. I guess it's something that I'm still interested in and that I find relevant today. I was just wondering whether a more recent publication would have been relevant as well, and we were working for quite some years on an anthology that came out in 2022 called Democratic Situations. And I think part of the approach there is deeply inspired by critical proximity and this idea that democracy is something that emerges in multi-directed ways, in situated ways, with multiple actors trying to achieve different things, and not something that is first and foremost a big theoretical idea. So I think in that sense it lives on in the way I think about my work and the way I approach empirical work. Yeah.
Right, and let's unpack that a little bit because it is very much the case that as this video goes up in the future, people may watch the video without having maybe have read the paper. And so I guess just for anybody out there who may be watching in the future, why don't you sort of break down what the core argument is around critical proximity and why you think that is important as opposed to the sort of more grand problematizing of something like colonialism, and
Yeah,
democracy and
sure. Well, the way I was thinking about it while rereading the paper, I guess what we're doing is to start from very sort of general outset. We're dealing with a classical tension in a way between critique on the one hand and construction or production on the other hand. And I guess that's a classic tension there, and it became relevant in new ways while techno-anthropology was emerging as a field, because critical technology studies, just to use one term, on the one hand, was a big source of inspiration for many. You could mention Feinberg's work, many others. And at the same time, social studies of technology, broadly speaking, actor network theory inspired approaches were also prominent in this early phase. So I think what critical proximity tries to do is to side with the latter and try to make an argument for how to be critical without taking a critical distance. So how to maintain some kind of critical edge, to not sacrifice, into an everything goes approach, but at the same time trying to avoid distancing yourself from the object of study by mobilizing a strong normative theory in advance, and instead looking at how normative ideas grow out in the empirical data. So from the actors that you study, from the dynamics that you're scrutinizing as a techno-anthropologist, how do critiques and normative ideals show up in practice, and how are they pointing in different directions? How do they rub up against each other? Which ones are sidelined? Which ones become underpinned by other actors, and sort of make it more of an empirical interest. And I could expand a bit on that because we were talking about also how some of that, or you mentioned in the beginning in a very useful way, how some of that is maybe a natural anthropological attitude in some ways, or at least in applied anthropology. And I noticed that there are two perhaps ways in which Morten and I came to this argument that might reveal a bit more about it, because we didn't mention it yet, but there's a footnote where we mentioned George Marcus's work. I don't know if that will be familiar to everyone, but he talks about multi-sided ethnography and this idea that it's important to not divide the world up in sort of a theoretical grand macro level and an empirical micro level, where you sort of study the local indigenous people perhaps, and then add a contextual layer that's abstract and idealistic, or at least normative and theoretical. And I think Morten was at the time very interested in this multi-sided approach. And I think so that's one way in which we also draw in inspiration. And I think from my side, I also came from an interest in French pragmatist sociology, the work of Thévenot, Boltanski and Thévenot. There's a book called On Justification, which is a more sociological approach, but it argues that we should understand critique as a social practice, as something that is happening in the everyday lives of actors, and not as the privilege of the academic or the criticist or the researcher. So that's, I don't know if you can follow me, but that's two sort of intellectual developments that I think inspired us for thinking about critical proximity.
Yeah, thanks. And your very last point there, you made the point that critique sort of can arise from everybody ultimately. And that's wonderful in that we really get to give voice to all of those, again, sort of very situated issues. However, that can also sometimes be challenging to deal with, right? And so if we are focused, right, at that level of analysis, how might we handle everything that arises from all of the stakeholders that we may engage with in a research project?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And that's perhaps also my main reflection while rereading the paper, that once I got to the 4 guidelines, we proposed 4 guidelines for how to do this in practice. In addition to discussing at length 2 different case studies. And I have to say, after reading those guidelines, I feel that that's certainly sort of the biggest challenge that you're left with. And Torben also was wise enough to say that these papers also raise issues more than settle them. But I think you're definitely left with a big task in terms of opening up a world that's messy and that has a lot of, I mean, we even have one of the guidelines says there's new roles for methods. So you can't even, there's no safe place you can withdraw to in terms of a methodological recipe that you can follow. So speaking to that without sort of pretending to have sort of the answer, I think an important detail in the paper is that we are also discussing both Noor Maras's work and Bruno Latour's work, and we're not just building on it in a harmonious way. We're also saying, well, in fact, Latour's approach can even sometimes be too procedural or sound too much like it has a solution to how to handle all this. So we mentioned Latour's sort of 2-step process, where first we have to find out what's out there, and then we can compose the collective. And different sort of formats for that comes to mind. Calong and colleagues proposed the notion of hybrid forums, for instance, for organizing processes where you can compose the common world. And Noor discusses this as sort of a cosmopolitical approach. And perhaps that's part of the answer. Like, you can draw on these formats and think about hybrid forums and cosmopolitics and different procedures for taking these things into account. But in this paper, we actually side more with Noor Maras's critique of that, where she argues that, well, the whole point is that when you're interested in issues and problematizations and critiques as they happen in real life and in practice, then part of what's at stake is who is the appropriate public to consult and what is the appropriate format. So in that sense, we deliberately try to not provide too strong an answer to the question of how to carry this out.
And so do you think if you wrote it today, would you change that?
No, I don't think so, but I definitely think that it would be interesting to push further and try to develop in more even more specifically what it might look like. Yeah.
Might be an opportunity there.
Yeah. For everyone.
Yeah, it's a good call for everyone. So, you referenced some of the lineage of thought there. You also reference Haraway, and I think for people who might debate you in this worldview and might lean towards critical distance, I think many of them might even, I don't want to presume, right? But I think many could like probably could side with you on like the Haraway and the God trick and why that could be problematic. But also, I think there are still many folks out there who would be still hesitant to sort of embrace this worldview and would still sort of move in the direction or lean towards critical distance. And, there is an argument to be made, for given some things that are going on in the world. And so, what would you maybe say to them right now?
That's a broad question and deeply relevant. And I think in a way it's nice that you put it the way you do, because it shows that there's a point that this paper exists. It has an audience, and it can also, spark real discussion and real debate. And I think I certainly know some colleagues that would argue in a different direction. And obviously, for me, it's also not so satisfying to just say, well, let's drop critical distance. We can just have critical proximity and everything goes. If that's not the intention. So I guess the more sort of nuanced answer that we are aiming at is to say that we can make a difference as researchers if we pay detailed attention to the critiques that are already existing within the objects or the actors we study. So, and by paying attention and describing that through papers, but maybe also through other kinds of interventions that are available to us as researchers in terms of dissemination or data visualizations and so on and so forth, it's possible to add new descriptions to the world and to make a positive difference still. And that might be even more called for today, given the world events, to be able to say, well, we're picking up this sort of nuance in how, for instance, a commercial web platform is performing public life or performing democracy. And we are redescribing that, and we are making that available in new ways, so that can be added to the way in which we are trying to launch critiques and to improve the state of affairs. So I guess it comes down to sort of a belief that maybe a sort of a performative or interventionist idea that is also dear in many ways to TANTlab's trajectory, that it makes a difference to make new descriptions. Yeah.
Yeah, and I have originally I had I think a related question that now might just be a comment based on what you just said, but your third guideline is about sort of researchers being able to take on new roles when we work with others who help sort of surface the critiques. And certainly an argument that I've made and encourage others is, to engage, to enact change, and to kind of, given where I work in industry, to get out, to build, to start companies, and to make a difference through those ways. So aside from any of the things that you did just share, anything you want to weigh in there on that third guideline? Again, I know now it's kind of more, this was more of a statement than a question, but any thoughts on that?
Good question. Not immediately, no.
Okay. So, but bringing it back, because you did also just mention the platforms. It strikes me when looking at the two case studies, they're both there's process to both. They're both methodological in the way that they're described. One, though, is maybe, at least in its description, a little bit more kind of participatory design like. The other one a little bit more heavy on digital methods using third-party platforms. So while they both fit, they look a little different on the surface. So any reflection on like those particular case studies to sort of make the point, anything you learned from that you want to share about those and why you selected those?
Yeah, I think, I mean, obviously there's always pragmatic reasons for selecting case studies, and and we were both Maud and I were working on other things at the same time. And so I think there's two ways of shedding some light on that. I think one is that there's sort of this field building ambition in the paper, contributing at least to making it possible to have a conversation about techno-anthropology. And for that, it was useful, or it felt useful at least, to have two very disparate cases, because it could sort of lend a power to the generalizability of the approach, to say, well, we can discuss this at the level where two so different cases can be included. So in that sense, it's sort of also maybe a land grabbing move to say, it can be applied in a very broad range of contexts and cases. And then I think there's certainly different things going on in each case that are worth talking about. You could see, I mean, I'm not going to go into detail about Morten's case. He knows much more about it than I do, but I think there's a general sort of interest there in the knowledge politics of social science research, and sort of how do we actually get to know users? What does it mean to involve the public? And I think that's a strong sort of an important question that other related researchers have also raised, and it could speak into that kind of tradition for how do we enact the public with different social science methods, participatory methods. What does that mean for who gets to say? And in my own case, which is the one, I don't know if we do signal that explicitly, that we have each our own case. I guess there's also very much a defense for digital methods going on, which is and was important for me also at the time, given the role of digital methods in TANTlab and in Techno-Anthropology. Because, and I think it's not unfolded very much in the paper, but it's just something that I was thinking about while rereading it, that you can almost sense that there's a lot of critiques, methodological critiques, that can be raised from more conventional sociological or anthropological perspectives about this kind of repurposing of commercial online platforms, and to harvest data via Facebook or Google. Questions about, representativeness, questions about groundedness, transparency, authenticity. Where do these data come from? How do we sort of fill out the blanks around them when it's opaque, and when the part of it is a black box of corporate algorithms and corporate data, proprietary data. So I think that runs through that case study, that we also need to have a conversation about how we're going to handle that. And when we talk about the distributedness of methods as something that's always there, and which is explicated as something to deal with when it comes to digital methods, and perhaps foregrounded. So at least I think, to sum up, the different cases potentially add some generalizability to the approach, but I think they also point in very different directions. I agree about that. And I guess the next step could be to say, well, if we want to have this general approach, maybe we should talk across more than two cases, and cases that represent more of a continuum rather than two different directions.
Torben, I saw you came off mute. Did you want to say anything? No, good. Okay, so just building on that real quick, I guess I'm wondering, in your worldview, since writing this, has anything changed with your perspective around platforms and around, sort of the use of that data, particularly, I guess, as it relates to, surfacing these kinds of issues? Any new concerns, anything about, any difference of opinion?
Yeah. I think this is something that stayed with me, and it's something I'm thinking about today. So, what's the role in public life for commercial digital platforms? Is a key question, obviously, and I think we've seen in a way a radicalization and a polarization since the paper emerged. So, or since the paper came out. So perhaps we've lost a bit of the potential that I saw at the time in a platform like Facebook for registering in a broad and perhaps more open and perhaps today it seems a bit innocent to sort of hope that Facebook can in fact host these kinds of conversations that can lead us to critical proximity with the issues that people experience in their daily lives. Not only because of different versions of surveillance capitalism but also in terms of just the fragmentation of platforms that we're perhaps witnessing right now, where it's hard to point at one platform that would collect these kinds of public interactions in a convincing way. But on the other hand, what's really what I'm observing right now, and what's catching my interest right now, is sort of a potential reaction against that, a potential new wave or new generation of social media platforms emerging partly in response to the call for European digital sovereignty, partly in response to critiques of Chinese platforms and American platforms, that tries to reinvent what it might mean to have a public conversation on social media. And I'm seeing right now, at least 7 or 8 different initiatives just happening in Denmark right now, where people are trying to build new social media platforms and arguing that we need a new sort of that's why I'm talking about a new generation, perhaps, which is informed partly by an interest in being grounded, locally grounded in new ways that are remarkable, given the focus that has been on, free speech platforms where everything goes, there's no moderation, just do what you want. Or on the other hand, open source distributed platforms where you can where location is almost something you're trying to do away with. So that does give me a renewed interest in these kinds of platforms, and a new hope, perhaps, that some of these things can continue in new ways.
Great, thanks. And so there's obviously more to be said on that last point for sure, but I want to ask one quick last question, and then I think we should open it up to the group. And so, you mentioned Marcus earlier and multi-sided, and you also have made it clear that, while the paper puts forward critical proximity, it's not that you're against critical distance, and you did just use the word surveillance capitalism, right? And so I guess my last question here is, how might you bring those together? Maybe taking inspiration from something like multiscalar, like one of the other sort of multi-paradigms, but any thoughts on how we might bring these into conversation potentially within every project?
Yeah, I think that's a very important impetus to end on. And in a way, right, it would be go a bit against my argument to be completely against critical distance, because critical proximity is not about, repeating this gesture of pushing things away. And I think actually that's something that I think Latour does a bit too much in his work. He says he has a very strong criticism of critical sociology. So it becomes a very sort of almost a repetition of critical distance in the way he says critical sociology is the big enemy. And I think it would be more sort of in line with the argument to stay with an interest in how is critical distance also relevant, how is it also performed, but bringing it down to earth and saying, so which actors produce which kinds of critical distance, and how does that align with which kinds of critical proximity. So how do these things enter into alliance with each other? You could imagine a case study where you were observing actors mobilizing Susanna Zuboff's book and talking about surveillance capitalism and, getting some gravitas behind their actions by aligning with certain concepts and theories. And that would be a way to situate critical distance and maybe enter into critical proximity with it. These things also only circulate in limited ways. It's a big book. It's an expensive book. So who even reads it? Where does it circulate exactly? Who has this resource available for them? So I think there's many ways to open that connection up between the two. And I think again, this paper is exactly not a rejection of critique. I think in a way it's an attempt to partly save critique from being something that we have to give up on.
Great. And that's probably a good place to end this portion. So we'll open it up to questions. Anybody want to jump in? Laura?
Yes, thanks. Hi, Andreas. Good to
Hey,
see
Laura.
you. Yeah, thank you so much for this paper. I mean, it's really one of my favorite reads. I often try to teach it and then fail. But okay, I have a lot of questions, but maybe the one that is like closest connected to what you were saying towards the end is this metaphor of distance and proximity, right? It's such a binary. So I wonder, whether we could think a little bit, hypothetically or like speculatively, like are there better metaphors of thinking about the kind of critique that we do, right? And I suppose like feminist STS would suggest something like multiplying normativities or, sort of what you were just talking about, like trying to find out what are the normativities that are existing and who perpetuates them and what is the, a different story to tell or something. So maybe you could respond to that. And the other question, so many, is on the willingness of the public. Like we somehow seem to assume that, if only we opened our doors, they will all just stream in and participate and, STS can once a day save the day. And I'm not sure that's where we are. And yeah, maybe also you can just respond to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Very nice questions and the hard ones. I mean, to the first one, I think the bet we make is that some kind of orientation in a world of multiple ontologies and multiple kinds of critique and multiple kinds of worth is sort of what we hope is the outcome when entering into critical proximity. So I guess if we should sort of stay with the metaphor, proximity shouldn't lead to a binary state. It should lead to an explosion of perspectives. And I think while rereading the paper this morning, I think it also became clear to me that there's a whole background in the discussion which pops up here and there, which is about what is a controversy, what's a controversy study, and we argue for issues instead of controversies and that's related in my world to also a discussion between actor network theory in a classic way and what has sometimes been called post-ANT and an interest in multiple ontologies and which format has space for that. So I think we can certainly recognize that concern already in the paper and in this. And so a way to talk about it could also be to say, let's talk about issues instead of controversies. And that could also relate to your second question, actually. So will they participate? Well, in what? I mean, so and who gets to decide what counts as participation and frame sort of that arena that that decides, that demarcates participation? I think that's sort of the question that I think we raise with the help of Nortje Maris's work, and we say, well, issues always emerge together with the public that responds to the issue, or that co-frames the issue, so that this whole question about whether we can get the public, assume that the public will participate and save the day, is sort of the problem of relevance that we need to stay with and not think that we can solve. Yeah.
Torben, I think you were next.
Yeah. Thank you. I just want to say, everybody, that Andreas absolutely beautifully presented the paper. I'm completely on board. So the question I want to ask you is, Andreas, is that when I reread the paper also this morning, it sort of struck me that there's something here about it's kind of there's a bit of a dream in here that we can be sort of sensitive and patient when we investigate things, and we can also be willing to risk our own moral standpoint as we sort of engage with actors and follow how issues emerge and how they try to compose a common world. And I think that's both sort of that's a very laudable tradition or ambition to have. And I think it's a great approach. But the thing that I would like to ask you about is that I can see at least two things sort of that has perhaps gained more impetus in the last 10 years, that pulls in another direction, that pulls away from this kind of patience and care and being able to risk your own position. And I think one thing I would point to is the role of media in a broad sense. I think research is now surrounded more and more by people who wants us to make sort of fairly pitched accounts of what we're doing. They want a quick comment. When they want experts for the news, they want someone to present one particular viewpoint that they could oppose to another. So anything from patience and anything from risking your moral standpoint. So that's one thing. Another thing is like and here I'm speaking as a middle-aged man. You know, when I go to conferences and talk to other middle-aged men in the conference break, then people like me tend to say that, well, there's a younger generation of scholars who tend to be sort of rereading Marx. They're introducing really hardcore capitalist critiques, or critiques about coming up from colonialism or queer theory or something like that. So for old guys like me, it seems like there's a younger generation that is more sort of reinventing critical sociology, or even sort of a radicalized version of that standpoint, various types of stuff, than a younger generation that is sort of throwing themselves into this game of critical proximity, which is more uncertain and ambivalent. And you know, so do you have any comments on and of course it's a complete caricature of the younger generation and of older men at conferences, but do you have any comments on, you know, what is the media doing and what is the younger generation doing to the beautiful dream of critical proximity?
Yes, thank you. I mean, as I want to be old man, I think it's our job to stand firm when we meet the younger generations, and when we meet the media. I think, when you were talking, what came to my mind was Max Weber's old essay on science as a vocation, where he discusses sort of both the practicalities of pursuing a career as a scientist, but also about this duality of trying to be value free in the way you pursue your research, while always necessarily being a subjective researcher that has certain experiences and certain values and beliefs. And I think maybe it's a bit boring answer, but I think we should certainly not become too. We shouldn't panic when the media ask for sound bites, or when the younger generation becomes very enthusiastic about certain strong principles and ideals. I think we should lead the way by sticking to critical proximity and to rereading the paper and and making sure that we do not suddenly think that we should just then go along with a media world that asks us to be sound extremely certain or to participate in very controversial debates that gives interesting headlines. And it's also a vulnerable time for researchers to be in public debate because you easily become cast as too biased, ironically. So I think we have just the same task in a way that we always had of staying calm, staying cool, and balancing these things because they actually are a balance.
Mathieu?
Hi, Andreas. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts on this. I would very much like to hear you on two observations that come to my mind right now, because we are facing these large language models that are very difficult to critique. And probably the most famous paper criticizing LLMs is the stochastic parrots paper. And I take it as a critical distant paper because the key argument is very a priori, which is, namely that LLMs don't really think because they are just parrots that just produce tokens like machines. And I believe that it largely fails as a form of critique, although it may also succeed in other ways, but it largely fails because each of my students' experience with LLMs is that it is manifestly intelligent. It speaks to you. So the 2 points where I'd like you to comment are first, the fact that it looks like critical distance is still the default way to criticize nowadays, first. And second, given that the stochastic parrots paper was actually written by people who know very well what an LLM is, I'm thinking of course, Timnit Gebru, but also Emily Bender. It should be, or it could have been a critical proximity paper, and yet it landed as something that is critical distant, presumably not because they were distant, but because of the way they wrote it. So I wanted to hear you on this and on the fact that the distance comes from the writing.
Yeah, I think it's a strong observation. I think it's an interesting object of study as well, of course, LLMs. But and you can say there's two things to discuss here. There's the writing style of papers about LLMs and especially the very cited paper you mentioned, and then there's what we could do when we engage with LLMs. So both things are worth talking about. But I definitely agree with you that critical distance is probably still the order of the day in many ways, and it's super effective in public discussions to deploy a critical distance. In that way, the paper hasn't changed the world. And I don't think it will. I think it's also just a very strong social effect to be able to mobilize a grand narrative, and we can then you can sort of be interested in how that becomes possible and study sort of public debate and different formats of arguments in public debate and different rhetorical moves. And the stochastic parrots paper is perhaps also worth studying for the rhetorical moves that it makes about generalizing and so on and so forth. And then there's this other aspect, which is, could we do different things with LLMs? And I think you have your own answers as well, but we can definitely study them, I think, in different ways. There's a paper that I wrote, co-authored with Hjalmar Carlsen back in the day, which takes the Facebook feeds algorithm as an object of study and argues that we don't have to accept the vision of the world that it enacts and the way it justifies ranking content in different ways, but we also don't have to to go back to a critical distance where we then point fingers and say, look, this is detrimental to democracy, that the edge rank algorithm works the way it does. Instead, we look at, how does it also become difficult to live in that world for the people living there? So when you talked, I was thinking about an example of how this is going on right now, what came to mind was Elon Musk's trouble with Grok, his own LLM chatbot, and that there's a way, I think, a way in to start studying in practice how do LLMs also themselves spark new moments of criticism and make life difficult for those that are trying to live in that world, and what can we learn from those instances?
Thanks.
And Matthew, you were next.
Yes, thanks, Matt. Yes, Andreas, thanks so much for this paper. I really appreciated it. I think it's the whole thing of issuification. It's a powerful way of kind of understanding and helping to illuminate public debate in different settings, contexts. I love the way you worked with the Google metrics and then kind of layered the Facebook conversations on top of that as a way of kind of working beyond the algorithms and so forth. So I really do appreciate the work you're doing, building on SES and so forth. I think the question I have is maybe particularly coming out of the US context and as we discussed, like the political polarization that we're living through here today, is how do we think about issues of like power, ideology, indifference, for example, not necessarily from a transcendent place, but even from a place maybe of construction, so for production that we ourselves are a part of, thinking less about ideology, but maybe ideological work that's taking place. And I'm building on like Susan Gale and Judith Irvine had this piece that came out a couple of years ago called Ideologies of Difference and so forth. And I think that gets lost when we're strictly focused on kind of critical proximity. I think we've been all kind of dancing around this issue, but so maybe I'll just leave it there. This question of how do we think about maybe in an embedded way power, ideology, and difference as analysts.
Yeah. That's a very good question and a tough one, and obviously a very serious question given sort of the state of the world. And I appreciate that, and I also would like to, of course, highlight my own ignorance in just sitting here in Copenhagen, and sadly I haven't been traveling to the States in the last years of my life. So, and something I'd like to do. So I'm not sort of in critical proximity with the practices that I think are beyond and behind what you're saying. But I guess the problem with ideology in a way is that it quickly becomes critical distance, right? So the problem is that many of these sort of moves that create polarization feeds on critical distance and this ability to say, well, I have a big theory about the world, and I think you're the evil person, and we're the good guys, and sort of, in that sense, I think the problem you point to calls for a way to work around critical distance, and if critical proximity can be of some kind of assistance to that, of course, that would be beautiful. But it's not easy, as you point out. It's not straightforward how it would work as sort of an more than a scholarly move. But as a researcher, as an academic, it would definitely involve again bringing these ideologies down to earth and trying to sort of explode them into sort of where do they draw resources from. What are the more mundane factors that draw people to these ideologies? Perhaps the multiplicity and the different trajectories that lead people towards groupthink and towards strong polarized views of society, and trying to, with that, being proximate in order to be able to, disentangle how it's actually quite different things that can lead to this result. And by perhaps describing that, opening up new avenues for picking it apart a bit, So maybe the answer is to do something about the deeply polarized state of affairs in the US that I hear you talk about. Part of the answer is to find the 1,000 different reasons that leads to that situation, and then start unpacking it bit by bit, more than making another grand gesture.
Yeah.
Thank you, Andreas. I think
just
we
thinking about.
time for
Go ahead.
Sorry, Matt.
Go ahead.
Just one quick question from Anders Grundtvig, and then we have to end this. Sorry, Matt.
I'll try to be very brief. Thank you, Andreas. Just thinking, and I love this paper and been talking about critical proximity since I read it the first time a lot. So I've been thinking about how close can we get with losing the critical sense. And what I mean is that, for example, yesterday I was teaching a course on ethics, and we talked about Sundhedsplatform was like the health platforms, and it's the company Epic who made it, and we were criticizing their AI solutions from a distance. But then how close can we get? Like, is it critical proximity to start working for them, for example, and to understand what's going on and what type of algorithm they're making? But I would argue that then we're losing the critical sense. So how close should we get?
Yeah.
When we are doing critical proximity.
Thank you, Anders, for the nice words and for the good question. I think it's yes, we should start working for them if it's necessary for producing a good critical proximate account. But I think we actually have a good resource for answering your question, which is founded in the tradition for participatory observation in ethnography and anthropology, because I think we are aiming for exactly that kind of insider-outsider position all the time, which enable us to come close to the local intentions and critiques and local meanings, while maintaining a sort of a research interest that's systematic and that's trying to register these things. So I think one way to think about what you're asking is to think about the position as a participant observer, and how to stay in that tension. And if you feel that you're sliding into a position of fully internal or insider position, or if you're sliding into a position of complete outsider, then you might want to adjust. And I guess this is also a way to point to how the critical proximity approach draws on Techno-Anthropology in a way. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Andreas, for taking on this grand tour through critical proximity. I want to thank everybody for participating and asking a crowd of excellent questions. I think we covered a lot of ground here, both about what is the difficulties of coming to terms with this term, what are the implied images of distance, what does this mean in terms of writing, what does this term mean in terms of maneuvering spaces as academics amidst the press, amidst polarization, amidst all sorts of different things. So I think it's been a really fascinating journey and wonderful to have this concept reinvigorated and brought up to speed, so to speak. So thank you very much to everybody for participating. Special thanks to you, Andreas, of course, and thanks to my co-organizers. We will continue next week, next Wednesday, with a paper on AI and computational anthropology. And on that session, it will be Mathieu, who is the author, who will be interviewed by Matt to figure out what that's all about. So thank you very much for today, and hopefully see you next week.
Thanks so.
See you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Torben.